There we are. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our international ground round from Association Naso Sano. I'm very glad today that I have a special guest. Today, Kasper van der Meulen. Am I right, Kasper, to
Van
pronounce?
der Meulen, Kasper van der Meulen. Yeah, it's good enough. Yeah.
Great, great. So I've requested Casper to be part of this in the ground rounds because the topic today is very important, and I think it should be focused on something different from the simple lifestyle, but also on something that will improve our mindset and our body. So today's title is Conscious Breathing Intervention to Improve Your Lifestyle, and just a brief introduction from Casper. Kasper is a breathwork specialist. He's personally coached some of the most elite performers from Olympic athletes, a special operation. He's a high power CISO and the likes. So, what today, what I want you to understand is that he runs a cutting edge breathwork masterclass where he teaches health coaches, breathwork facilitators, physiotherapists, doctors, personal trainers, and other professionals. So, in order to understand what he's going to talk about, you have to understand his personality and what he's doing for the community. So, for everyone interested, for audience, today the classroom is not just for doctors and scientists, but also for the community. So any kind or any other questions should be asked as usual at the end of his introduction and his topic. Please, Casper, if you have any slides, share with the audience.
Yes, yeah, I'll share some slides later on. First of all, I'd like to say thank you. I'm very honored to be here today to speak to a group of people who knows all about the nose, and who also a group of people who may, require some introduction to breathing. And a little bit about my background. I used to be a science teacher, a high school biology teacher, and I was noticing a lot of students dealing with chronic stress and anxiety, and a lot of other health issues that I also had myself. I used to be very overweight. I have smoked for about half of my life, smoked cigarettes. I used to have a lot of allergies, a lot of things that severely challenged my general well-being, but also especially my mental well-being. And I started on a journey to figure out why this is. Why is it so difficult to live optimally and to have a healthy mind and body in this really amazing modern time that we're living in? And at the same time, what are the things that we can do to influence our health and well-being on a lifestyle level? So what are the conscious interventions that we can do that can take us from where we are to where we want to be? So to say. So what I will share with you today is a little bit of my story about how I got to where I am. Then I'm going to just discuss a very general, broad overview of some scientific theoretical principles that relate to breathing, to conscious breathing, and the way that we can use those practically to influence our health and lifestyle on a daily basis. And I'm going to mainly introduce these topics from a nervous system perspective. And there's also, of course, the biochemical perspective where you focus on nitric oxide and CO2 and oxygen. But what I like about explaining it from a nervous system perspective is that we can then easily also tie in the lifestyle and the things that we do on a daily basis, and how they influence our health and our life quality, but especially also how the modern world and the lifestyle of the modern world that we're living with today really negatively influence our health and well-being and our breathing in general. So my perspective as a breathing teacher, a breathing instructor, is not about pathology. It is not about, what are the issues with the nose and the throat and how can we repair those. My perspective is very much about how can a normal everyday human use conscious breathing interventions to improve their lifestyle, so their general well-being, but also their self-regulation in the moment. So that's kind of my background. And I started, like I said, from my own lifestyle issues where I was overweight and smoking and had all these problems, but I was also working as a science teacher at the time. And the children that I worked with had a lot of stress and they had a lot of anxiety and worries about making tests. And at some point I read this study that said, the breath rate and the heart rate are connected, and we cannot consciously control our heart rate, but we can consciously control our breath rate. We can decide to slow down our breathing. And specifically, this article stated that lengthening the exhale, so consciously controlling and lengthening the exhale, would stimulate the vagus nerve. And as many of you may know, the vagus nerve is the let's say, the most important actor in the parasympathetic nervous system that has to do with control and regulation, but also rest, recuperation, and proper immune function, for example. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. I'll do a little experiment with my students, and I will do a breathing technique with them before we do a test. And the children would come into the classroom, and they had their shoulders up, and their faces were tense, and I could visibly see that they were slightly breathing a bit higher into their chest. And I decided, before we start the test, and this was a physics test, so they were all very nervous, I decided that I would do a breathing practice with them. And basically, we did a calm nasal inhale and then a lengthened mouth exhale through pursed lips, like that. And we did about 3 minutes of this conscious breathing until their shoulders would drop and their faces would relax, and I would see them improve their state. And then I would start the test, and what do you know, these children had less stress and less worries, and their grades would improve. And of course, the parents were very happy. And suddenly there was a lot of interest in, for me, but also in the school, to kind of research what's going on here. What can we do with this? And this is 6 or 7 years ago. And since then, I've been on a path of continuously always trying to find the best ways to improve our well-being. And every time I study different topics like nutrition or sleep or other lifestyle things like movement, stretching, or whatever it may be, it always comes down to breathing being one of the most powerful interventions that we can use, because it always happens in the moment. And this is a very interesting thing to me, that breathing is the most important thing you do, right? And if you think other things are more important, then try to hold your breath while you do all the other stuff first, right? It doesn't work. You need to breathe. It is the fundamental biological function that we have, right? So it's the core function that allows our body to metabolize fuel into energy and to actually live. So it's also actually, from that perspective, it is kind of logical to assume that when we want to influence our state and our well-being, that our breath is one of the first things we have to start looking at. Now, what I find a very interesting perspective, and I will show you, I'll start to get on to my slides in just a second. All right. So what's very interesting is we think about the nervous system in this somatic and autonomic, where they're completely shifted. And especially if you're a physician, you think about these as, you have the somatic nervous system, the big muscle groups, for example, and we have the autonomic nervous system. And the function of the autonomic nervous system, which physicians are mainly, of course, very interested in because it holds the immune system, is completely out of our control. But between those functions of the somatic and the autonomic, right in the middle there is basically our breathing. It's our only core function of life that is both within control of our somatic nervous system, so we can consciously control our breathing better than any other animal on the planet, but we can also have it run on autopilot. And if we only have it run on the autopilot, on the autonomic functions, then it's easy to lose control. And for example, when our homeostasis is dysregulated because of a traumatic event or an illness or a surgery, or anything basically that challenges our autonomic nervous system, then it can also change our breathing rates and our breathing function chronically. And then we have to make a conscious intervention to come back to basically reprogram our autonomic nervous system to have better breathing control. So I will, for the people who are not initiated in this nervous system talk, I will very briefly take you through a few slides. Let me, over here, yes, okay, there we go. And my main aim with this is to show you a few very simple functions of this nervous system, right? So in this autonomic nervous system, we know that we have this sympathetic state, which is known as the fight-flight state, and we have this parasympathetic state, which is the rest and digest state. Now, the way I explain it usually is, imagine that you are a hunter-gatherer, right? Because we are basically still built as our hunter-gatherer ancestors that roamed the plains 100,000 years ago. And in that life, you have two settings, basically. One setting is you are safe, which means you're kind of in your settlement, in your cave, if you're a caveman. You're in your house, right? You're in a safe environment with your tribe. And you have a setting where you go out of your cave, where there is an inherent unsafety. So once we go out of, let's say, our cave as we are hunter-gatherers, we step into a relatively unsafe environment. A few things need to happen. First of all, our senses need to open. We need to have clearer vision. Our hearing becomes more sharp. Our skin becomes more sensitive because we need to be on the lookout, right? So our nervous system is collecting information about what we need to do to survive. Now, the next thing, of course, is we need to have our breathing speed up and our bronchi to dilate because we need more oxygen. Why do we need more oxygen? Because we need more energy, because we're in a setting where we may have to fight or flee. Then, of course, that means that our circulation needs to go up, our heart rate goes up, the blood pressure goes up, and our liver makes sure that we have a little bit more glucose in our system with the help, of course, of cortisol, which is known as the stress hormone. And in that state, our digestive functions, so for example, the stomach acids and the digestive fluids in the mouth and everything, they are generally suppressed, and also the reproductive functions are suppressed. Now, this is, of course, a symphony of wonderful evolutionary mechanisms that allow us to activate, to produce a lot of energy, to be very alert and very sharp. But the mental and emotional state that comes with this is, of course, one not only of alertness and productivity and energy, but very oftentimes also of anxiety or of fear. Now, anytime that the nervous system is challenged by anything from the outside, there will be somewhat of a sympathetic response. There will be this fight-flight response. And this is completely fine. This is absolutely normal and healthy, of course, if that is an immediate response that you then come down from. So let's say as a hunter-gatherer, you're out of the cave, you're gathering food, you're protecting your territory, you're doing whatever you need to do out there. And then you come back into your cave, and then you can kind of numb your senses. You can go into a staring mode instead of a focus mode. You are less receptive to different inputs. Then also, of course, our breathing can finally slow down. We can take a sigh of relief. Our bronchi will contract a little bit, and we have a little bit of a slowing of the heart rate and the blood pressure. We actually take glucose out of the blood, and if everything goes well, digestive functions and reproductive functions will start up, and then we can actually eat the food that we need to eat. And this is a way of looking at the nervous system that is very common, of course. Now, what's interesting about the modern world is that in a lot of cases, we actually overstimulate our sympathetic nervous system. And when we overstimulate our sympathetic nervous system, we can easily get stuck into a heightened state of awareness. And basically what we want to be able to do in a healthy life is to, as you can see here in this visual, you wake up in the morning, you slowly activate, then you get, some nice energy, you have a productive morning, then you take a break where you have some lunch, you calm down, then you activate again, you get energy from your lunch. In the evening, you have dinner, and then you slowly go to sleep, maybe have some family time and do some sports. But in reality, what we do is we activate into this really high stress state, and then we stay there for the duration of the day. And over time, because the body basically adapts to function, right? Form adapts to function. We overtrain our sympathetic state, where we get into a state of chronic stress. And with this state of chronic stress, the ability of the body and also the mind to recover from stress gets lower and lower because we use it less and less. And this is kind of what we see in modern, also in modern medicine, of course, especially if you look at it from a lifestyle perspective, is that people chronically live in a stressful state where they produce chronic inflammation. Their ability to recover is very low. This also means that they take this heightened sympathetic state to bed, and they don't have proper restful sleep. And then we get into a cascade of issues. And for example, sleep issues are huge. I've always been very interested in the topic of snoring and sleep apnea, for example, because this is one of the problems that I have from my own lifestyle, where my nose was chronically inflamed. I breathe through my mouth throughout the night. And this is actually a very big issue. If you look at it on one day, so let's say you have one day that looks like this, and you have this heightened state, you work 14 hours, you're worried, in the evening you can't get to sleep. This is, of course, completely fine. Humans are resilient beings. However, if we chronically live in this state, we can also chronically build up quite a few problems that are related to stress. And as most physicians nowadays know, is that upwards of 90% of all health issues and diseases are either caused by chronic stress or kept active by chronic stress. So even somebody, for example, who has a little bit of a chronic stress situation, they have a minor operation, but they don't recover from the minor operation. because the tissues aren't in a state of regeneration because they can't access their parasympathetic state. And then, they need maybe some medication to deal with the pain or the inflammation, and the medication has some side effects. And then this whole kind of negative downward spiral starts to happen. Now, here is the good news. We all know that we have a state of mind and body, and with the state of mind and body belongs a state of breath, right? So when I talk about stress and you think about the most intense stress state that you can have, most up in your nervous system, it's a panic state. And a panic state, of course, comes with a state of breathing that is hyperventilation, breathing like this. And then if you're doing a workout, right, so you're very active and your muscles are firing and your heart rate is up, you're going to have heavy breathing through the mouth. If you are relieved, your body will produce a sigh of relief, a physiological sigh that makes you feel extra relief. And if you wake up in the morning, you should be able to breathe through your nose and in your diaphragm and breathe very calm. So we all know that a state of mind and body will produce a state of breath. And we can actually see from how somebody is breathing what kind of state they are in, right? So if you see somebody hyperventilating, you know how that person feels. They will feel panic, they will feel anxiety, they will feel worries and doubts. Now, here's the cool thing. If we talk about this bridge between the autonomic and the somatic nervous system, and breath being that bridge, then we can reason that a state of breath will also be followed by a state of mind and body. So if you hyperventilate, you will also start to produce a panic attack. And this has actually scientifically been proven in many different studies, most notably in a study on the Wim Hof method, where they showed that chronic hyperventilation, so heavy overbreathing, actually produce a really high amount of adrenaline, a significant amount of adrenaline. This was at will. So by somatically changing the rate and the pace of our breathing, we can change the setting of our autonomic nervous system and even produce adrenaline in the process. And in this particular study, it was actually shown that the autonomic nervous system was under the influence of this breathing. So they saw a significant suppression of interleukin 10, which you may know as an inflammatory marker. That, of course, plays a giant role in many inflammatory processes that we won't go into now, but it's also, for example, been linked to fighting off the coronavirus, right? So the cytokine storm has been linked to this interleukin 10. So that's a very interesting kind of technical detail. But the main important thing is that if you slow down your breathing, if you start to limit the amount of oxygen that you give your body, and you start to consciously control your breathing, effectively stimulating the nerves of the parasympathetic chain, you will also go into a calmer state of mind and body. And this is where a very interesting set of functions basically happen. And that means that if we consciously change the pace and the rate and the style and the rhythm of our breathing, we can also consciously change our state of being, our mental and emotional states, and even the things we feel. So let me see. Yeah, so there we are. So if you look at it from a very basic perspective, you can kind of divide the breathing functions that are sympathetic or parasympathetic into a very simplistic overview. And this is simplistic, but the cool thing is that if you start to study the different publications on breathing and the nervous system, of which there are actually hundreds, it's a very well-studied process, respiration, then you will start to see a few common threads. And this is really what I've been focusing on in the last few years, is to really see what stands out and what is really the foundation of breathing functions that we can consciously control. So we can control whether we breathe through our mouth or whether we breathe through our nose. We can control whether we use a chest breath and use mainly the upper ribs and the intercostals, or we can choose whether we mainly use the diaphragm. We can also choose whether we breathe fast or whether we breathe slow, and we can choose whether we focus on inhale or an exhale. And interestingly enough, if you kind of combine all of the different studies and you look at the different publications that have been, and you connect the dots, you can come up with this very simple overview that if there is mouth breathing relatively into the chest, relatively fast, with a focus on an inhale, then you are promoting more sympathetic chain activation in the nervous system. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have nasal breathing, which is, of course, the only right way of breathing for 99% of the time. And this is one of the most important topics in breathing that I can't stress enough is that nasal breathing is always of higher quality than mouth breathing. And what's also interesting, if you think about, you can actually shut your mouth, but you cannot shut your nose. It is always open. It's also the only, or let's say the biggest function that is always going on, right? So you're always breathing, and your internal environment is always exchanging with your external environment through the breath, right? So you can, for example, close your eyes and take away the visual input. You can close your mouth and take away like food input, but you can never stop breathing, which also means that your immune system is always dependent on breathing, right? Because every single thing that comes into your body needs to be scanned and detected and potentially fought off. And this, of course, the nose plays a giant role. Now, what most people in the modern world are suffering from is a state, like I said, of chronic sympathetic overactivation, which also comes with a state of chronic mouth breathing, relatively more use of chest breathing, faster breathing. So I'm talking chronic hyperventilation. So not the panic hyperventilation that I just discussed, but a chronic hyperventilation where people breathe up to 30 or 40 breaths per minute, which is far too many breaths. Now, in order to keep up with that pace, people will start to move to mouth breathing and the suboptimal chest breathing. And also really trying to activate muscles on the inhale in order to get enough. So the goal then is, if we want to be more capable of recovering from either an injury, from an intense moment, from sports, but also from surgery, if we want to be able to relax at the end of the day and actually and sit down for our meal and be able to digest our food, if we want to be able to actually come down into a resting state and fall asleep at the end of the day and have a restful night where we have proper breathing function during the night, you can see from all of this that it makes sense to start to slow down the breathing. That's the goal number one, right? Move to nose breathing, and learn to take a diaphragm breath. And the great thing is that these things are very much within our control. They are entirely free, and it doesn't get much more complicated than this. So in terms of what we can do to improve not just our mental state, our worries, our doubts, our fears, but also our ability, our body's actual physical ability to digest, to recover, to repair tissue, to have proper immune function, proper reproductive function, all of that is linked to a proper calm breathing state. So now I will go. I hope this is all still making sense, and this is great if I don't have a live audience and I can ramble on without anybody interjecting or disagreeing. So from all of this, if you consider we live in a very fast-paced world, we live in a very highly intense modern world, especially nowadays with lots of fear going on, lots of worries. People are worried about their respiratory health because we have a respiratory pandemic going on, basically a respiratory virus. This is a grand opportunity, of course, also to learn to do better breathing. And the first step that I like to tell people is, or like the main thing to make you aware of, is that you don't have to, of course, consciously breathe forever. It's all about understanding that the nervous system had some kind of reason to take on this mouth, chest, fast, and inhale breathing, because maybe you were scared or you had a traumatic event or a surgery, or like these reasons that I said, which is a perfectly fine adaptation. Your body was trying to maintain homeostasis and it just changed breathing function. Now, we don't actually have to then consciously control our breathing for the duration of the rest of our lives. No, all we need to do is take 5 to 10 minutes in a day. And if you're, let's say, a severe case, self-diagnosed, and you want to do more, you can do, 20 minutes in the morning or 3 times 5 minutes a day. It's literally that simple. And retrain these more parasympathetic, more calm, more regenerative breathing functions. And it really doesn't take more than a few minutes. So here's a few very simple practices that anybody can start doing right now that are completely free, and they won't take you more than a few minutes, and they will actually help you on many different fronts in life. And the first one is to just do a check-in with your breathing, preferably in the morning or if you come home from work, and ask yourself, which breathing functions am I using? Am I using mouth or nose? Is my chest mainly moving, or is more the lower part of my, so my lower ribs and my belly mainly moving? Am I breathing fast or slow? Oh, and there, of course, what is fast and what is slow? Well, you don't know. Um, and it doesn't really matter, because here's the fun thing, the most important, the easiest practice there is to sit down with a timer, and for 1 minute you count every inhale, which means you count how many breaths you are taking in a minute. Well, after that minute, whatever number you have, you divide it by 2, and then for the next 3 minutes you're going to breathe at the 50% rate and pace of what you were previously breathing. So let's say you do a count and you realize you're breathing 20 breaths per minute, which a lot of people with chronic stress do. But interestingly, and this has been studied for the first time already 40 years ago by Dr. Buteyko, who actually saw that everybody that he was treating in his hospital who was ill, who had some kind of illness, would breathe more than 18 breaths per minute, and also at a high volume. And everybody who was healthy and fully recovered breathed around 10 to 12 breaths per minute. So there is definitely a link between pathology and breathing rate. Now the question is it, it's a chicken or egg question, which we won't get into now. But the takeaway here is that all you need to do is then slow it down. So you take your timer, you set it for 3 minutes, and then you're going to again count your inhales, but now look for a pace that allows you to breathe 50%, so half of the speed that you were breathing. And the simplest way to do that is, for example, to look at your timer and to breathe in for 5 seconds, for example, and breathe out for 5 seconds. Because if you're breathing in and out for 5 seconds, it's 10 seconds per breath, and which is 6 breaths per minute, which is far, far less. And pretty much guaranteed, you will feel your body calm down and you will feel your heart rate drop and come into a more relaxed state. So that is a very simple practice where you can also kind of scan what is the state of my breathing. The next one that I'd like to show you is one that I call the one breath break. And we can actually do this right now. It's a very simple breathing technique where we breathe in for just as nice, as big, as full as we can. So let's do that. Breathe all the way in to your nose, of course. And at the top, you hold it for 3, 2, 1. Then you exhale, relaxation. And at the end of that breath, where it naturally stops, you wait. And in that little moment of silence where you don't breathe, you simply wait until you feel what is called the breathing stimulus, or they also call it air hunger. And upon that stimulus, you inhale through the nose and you go back to your normal breathing. And this is just one little breath that so this whole technique is just one breath all the way in. And the inhale kind of meets the sympathetic system where it is, right? Through the nose. Then you hold. And during that hold, you create a little bit of pressure on the lungs, which kind of it pushes what they call the parasympathetic button. So the pressure in the lungs simulates the vagal function on the heart to calm down the heart rate, the vagal brake, as it's also called. Then on the exhale, we relax into this long exhale, which again stimulates the ventral vagus nerve. And then you have a hold at the end, a natural hold. And that breath hold at the end is a moment where, of course, you're not getting any new oxygen into your system, but you do have an increase of CO2. And for the people who are familiar with respiratory physiology, you know that the Bohr effect makes sure that the more CO2 we have in our blood, the more available oxygen will be. And also, during this breath hold, we have nasal nitric oxide building up in the paranasal sinuses. So on that next inhale that you take after a hold, your body will meet that breath more openly and more readily because you have a higher level of CO2 and you have a little bit of nasal nitric oxide, which helps dilate the bronchi and open up the breathing pathways in general. So here we have this tiny little one breath break, which is basically a quick fix. You can do it in the middle of a meeting. You can do it when you're stuck in traffic, when you're worried. In the middle of an argument with your spouse, you can use this to calm down your system. So this is the second thing that I've mentioned, right? So the first one is just breathe at half of your normal rate. And then the second one is the one breath break, which is a full inhale, hold for a few seconds, relax in the exhalation, and then hold until you feel the breathing stimulus and go back in. You can do this one as many times as you want. Then I will finish off with this last breathing technique, which is called focus reset breathing. It is a very simple breathing protocol that, and if the people who are watching this and they're also seeing the slides, you can screenshot this and you can do it at any point. But also I have a guided version of this on my Instagram page and on my website. You can just find that. It's about a 4-minute breathing technique that you can, easily do 4 times a day. And I generally tell people that it's best to kind of ask yourself, what is the moment in my day that I feel that my mind is racing, I'm worried, I can't calm down, I'm more stressed than I want to be, and how can I actually calm down in that moment? Well, if you then can just take 4 or 5 minutes for yourself, sit down and do a breathing technique like this. And like I said, if it's more difficult to do self-directed, then you can always find this on my website or on my Instagram page and follow it. And we're also going to do it now all together so we can all end this session in a nice parasympathetic state. It starts with 4 seconds in, or 4 counts in and 4 counts out, and we'll do that 4 times. Then we're going to go into 4 rounds of box breathing, which is 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. And then we're going to lengthen the holds. And again, this is where we're going to limit the amount of oxygen available in the system, which will create a necessity for the heart rate to drop and for you to calm down. And during those holds, we will also increase the CO2, and especially during the exhale hold, we will produce more nasal nitric oxide that you can then breathe in. And the more you control your breathing, the more you have this parasympathetic activity. And this is actually a breathing technique that I developed 3 or 4 years ago. And there's a few, for example, people who work with group therapy, psychologists who do this at the beginning of their group therapy to relax everybody before they start. I even know some clinicians who suggest this for their clients to do in the morning and in the evening. And it seems to actually help them improve recovery, because this is, naturally when you increase the function of the parasympathetic nervous system, you are downregulating general inflammation, which allows for the recovery process to kind of speed up more readily. And again, this is something where there's so many publications on the anti-inflammatory effect of proper breathing. It's just something that we haven't been taught to use. So it's a bit of a different paradigm. So we're just going to do this one briefly, and then I'll be open for questions, and then I will shut my mouth for a second, which I'm just very excited to share. So I'll keep rambling. So we're all going to start to take a very deep breath all the way in, just to synchronize. So breathe in. Now let go. And just follow my count. Now breathe in. 2, 3, 4, and breathe out. 2, 3, 4, and breathe in through the nose. 2, 3, 4, and breathe out through the nose in relaxation. 3, 4. Breathe in. 3, 4, and breathe out. 2, 3, 4, and breathe in. But now at the end, we're going to hold 3, 4. So hold your breath. 2, 3, 4, and breathe out. 2, 3, 4, and hold your breath. 2, 3, 4. Again, breathe in. 2, 3, 4, and hold. 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4, and hold. 2, 3, 4. Now in, we're going to go to a double hold. 3, 4, and hold. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and relax. And breathe out. 4, and hold. And it may get a little bit challenging here. Just trust that your body knows what to do. 2, 3, 4, and breathe in. A nice big breath all the way in. 3, 4, and hold. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let go. Last 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold. 7, 6, 5, almost there. 3, 2, And breathe into your nose. Come back to your normal breathing. And we're going to take just a minute or two where we're going to wait and see how our body responds. So what are you noticing? Is your heart rate increasing or decreasing? And especially in this last little part of the technique where you had these longer holds, it gets a little bit challenging. And that moment where it's challenging, that is exactly the training stimulus that the body needs. And it's very well known and described that, so our chemoreceptors, the parts of our brainstem and of our carotid arteries that keep the CO2 and oxygen levels in check, they're the ones that are constantly in charge of making sure that we have the right amounts of CO2 and the right amounts of oxygen. Now, if we give them a little bit of a hormetic, so a training stimulus, we can actually retrain them to be less responsive to CO2, to be less likely to go into overbreathing and fast breathing, and to be more capable of remaining calm under this little bit of a breathing, challenge when you hold your breath. All right, so this concludes my theory part and the three little techniques. I definitely have some time for questions, but also if you would like to get the guided versions of this, or you have questions at any point, you can always find me. So yeah, Puya, I'm going to give it back to you. And close my, I can't hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me now? Great. So we have everyone got your attention at the end because I was telling them to, watch the whole panel, and we were actually looking for one of those training stuff that you provided. I'm very glad about this. Actually, I was doing the breathing technique while you were doing your explanation, and it reminds me for the first time I did those exercises when I was with my cousin Nima. By the way, I've been introduced to Kasper from my cousin Nima, who is currently doing an amazing job with his trip around the US.
Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, we have a bunch of questions. Some of them are more scientific, the others are not, more basics. And I think that we should start to some of the complements. By the way, we have Art of Living Trains Breathing, what they call as a Sudarshan Kriya. Yeah, I think that Prakash is she's part of our webinars daily. And so let's get from the first questions, scientific ones. Question from Denmark. Our colleagues is asking, would you mind if you're decreasing oxygen rates? What happens with the cardiac output if the patient is suffering from cardiac disease?
Yeah, so this is that's a good question, right? So you mean while doing a breathing technique, you mean?
Well, of course, Casper is not trained with cardiologists at all. But I try to let you understand what's the purpose of the question from a colleague. I think that he's complaining and asking if you do have a cardiac disease, which in terms is leading to a cardiac dysfunction like muscles and
Yeah.
the activity from the cardiac output, that decreased oxygen rate would affect the cardiac output.
So what's important there is my distinction. So what I'm trying to get from the question is
Yeah,
decrease in oxygen. You mean induced by a breathing technique?
I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the thing is that I don't know the metrics. I don't know the numbers on cardiac output because I haven't studied that topic specifically. But what is interesting to note is that changes in your breath rate and in the way you breathe do not influence your level of blood oxygen that quickly. Actually, the body doesn't respond to blood oxygen levels in a behavioral setting. It is usually CO2 that is a response because the chemoreceptors understand CO2 levels because those are the ones that change the pH level. Which means that in general, if you do a conscious breathing technique, you will barely ever see a drop in oxygen levels. So you can do this, with an oximeter, for example, and you will actually see that there is hardly ever a drop of blood oxygen. The main focus of this is to make oxygen more available in the tissues, right, by increasing oxygen and nitric oxide. And of course, nitric oxide will mainly be increased locally in the nose and in the airways. But if you improve function of, for example, hemoglobin, it will also carry and make nitric oxide more available systemically. So my point is here that allows actually for, and this is of course theoretically, and it depends on what kind of, I don't know anything about cardiac pathology, but in general, you can reason that doing a breathing practice will allow the availability of oxygen to increase when CO2 increases, which will also allow for the breath rate to drop, which will allow for the heart rate and the blood pressure to drop. So generally, and I do definitely get cardiac patients in my workshops, and I'm always very careful with them. So I only focus on very calming, relaxing breathing techniques. And we see, for example, drops in blood pressure are very common, right? So I can't specifically answer the question, but in general, we can kind of theorize how that would be helpful. And also that there's no hypoxia, right? You can create intermittent hypoxia with breathing techniques, but then you're doing an entirely different set of breath work.
Yeah, and in order to assess more this question, you do have to remind that when you're doing those kind of breathing exercise, you're putting oxygen in places where normally or usually the perfusion of this oxygen is not available. You're training the whole system. The breathing technique, I think, that also expand more the lungs, like usually not trained, because you're training also muscles that are inside of your lungs, and then this will lead to much better perfusion of the organs. And by meaning of that, I would stress more regarding the cellular activities and what's the cycle inside of the production of ATP and all these um, simple things that usually cells does. So it's the whole body that is differently behaving. By meaning of that, there's the other question from our colleague from France. They say, does those exercises prevent the reactive oxygen species production?
What do you mean by reactive oxygen species?
When yeah, of course. I'm forget. I just forgot that you're not into that.
I'm just
Reactive oxygen. Yeah, so, reactive oxygen in terms of cellular production or mechanism of cells doing stuff. Reactive oxygen species are produced where the system is not work currently in a right manner, and those species will lead to inflammation and to cellular death. So prevention of those are mandatory to prevent oxidative stress to the system and to the whole body and cells. So in terms of this, I think that the question is yes, in kind of sense, because we are thinking about oxygen, and oxygen is the nutrition for the cells. So I can reply if you want like this,
Well, yeah.
and and then.
This is a similar point actually as you were just talking about, where it's about perfusion of oxygen in tissues that are normally devoid of oxygen. And this is of course from a lifestyle perspective very common if people sit down too much, or they have some kind of actual like physical trauma and the tissues aren't oxygenated properly. And you can imagine, of course, this makes me think about, for example, the anaerobic response in cancer cells, right? There's a low amount of oxygen and then there's overproduction. And considering, and what you just said, I think is very important, that we want to look at allowing the entire system to improve function. And the things you also just mentioned, for example, lung function, is actually, so lung volume is one of the biggest determining factors for longevity. And most people, underuse their lungs for so long that they don't actually take up a full breath of oxygen. And then we have many of the tissues, especially in people with, for example, obesity, or who have moved too little, or even people who sit in wheelchairs. They have a much higher likelihood of having hypoxic tissues. And with breathing practice, you're actually training the entire capillary system, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an answer to the question, actually.
Yeah, I think that you did actually. Another question that it comes from the audience, Josephine from France, asking, "I'm suffering from asthma. Would you suggest me to do those exercises?"
Yes. So there is a whole field of lifestyle medicine related to breathing that was initiated by one Russian doctor called Mr. Buteyko. Some 40 years ago, he already started to realize that breath rate had significant, and also breath volume had significant influences on general well-being. And he started to train people with hypoventilation, so learning to breathe less, and especially in patients with COPD and with asthma, and especially exercise-induced asthma. That's one of the well, easiest. Let's say there's most effect in people with exercise-induced asthma, because you can actually train this. Where it was shown that chronic hypoventilation, so underbreathing, which is basically learning to breathe slower, would take away a lot of the asthmatic symptoms. I personally know dozens of people who have either been able to be free from their medication. I've never used the word cure or heal, but free from symptoms and medication, or have really been able to take down their medication significantly. If you imagine that, for example, what a lot of what the inhaler does, and I've done this with athletes also who are generally have a good physical fitness, and they still say, I need my inhaler every now and then. So what I then do with them is something like this one breath break, where you do an exhale and a hold, which allows nasal nitric oxide to increase. And if you think about what nasal nitric oxide does on a local level, once you breathe it in, you have a dilation of the airways. And I have then, for example, worked with asthmatic people who then do that exercise a few times in a row. And after about 5 to 10 minutes of practice, they get a feeling as though they have taken their inhaler, because it has a similar effect of opening up. So it won't fix it like that, of course, but there's a lot of and there's many publications also in this, and many even more anecdotes of people improving their asthmatic symptoms with conscious let's say slower breathing, hypoventilation. I myself have gotten rid of all of my allergies, my seasonal allergies, the pollen, and many issues like that with breathing. It is very important, though, to take it very slow and never to start moving away from medication without consulting a physician. But this is also why I think it's so important to speak to audiences like this, to understand that there's an option for combining treatment with medication with a lifestyle intervention, because then you're actually also giving somebody a tool, and then over time you can see whether the training has improved the condition and maybe taken away the reason for needing medication. And there are actually many doctors that I know, of course I have my own network of people that are interested in these things, who have also been trained in this specific method by this doctor that I mentioned, who is called Dr. Buteyko. It's the Buteyko breathing method, and there's also many free apps that help people to become free from allergies, asthmatic problems, and some COPD related issues. So the short
Yeah.
answer, yes.
Yeah. So I think that it's about the time to remind everyone your addresses, if anyone would like to follow your steps and suggestions. So as far as I understood, you have your Instagram pages and your social media channels, right?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the best place to find me is on my website is mindlift.com, mindlift.com. And that has links to my social media pages. I'm most active on Instagram nowadays. It's just the best platform to reach people. And the breathing techniques that I did in this session are available on my Instagram, and it's at Kasper's Focus, so Kasper RSFOCUS. Yeah, and if anybody watching enjoyed the session, feel free to drop me a message. If you have any other questions that you'd like me to answer, I'll gladly come back to that. Also, through one of these channels, you can find my email address also on my website.
Great. So last advice that, as a president of the association, I'm always giving to someone, but now I want to stress more, since we do have to adopt a correct diet and eat good food. We also need some training and a good breathing technique to understand that physiology and our whole system works proper when it teaches you this properly and you use it properly. So thank you so much, Kasper, for being with us today and giving to everyone a kind of lesson in breathing. So I really enjoyed this. For future, anyone is interested, you have his addresses and social media channels. You can just go there, type it, and watch it. Thank you, Kasper. For everyone interested, tomorrow Wednesday and Thursday, we are going to have two different meetings available. The first one tomorrow is going to be the endoscopic management of orbital trauma, and on Thursday, the landmarks to petrous and paropharyngeal carotid artery. Thank you, Kasper, for being with us, and I'll talk to you and I'll see you very, very soon. Goodbye, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.